We ended our story with Alfred Wegener's continental drift theory not being accepted by the scientific community. 20 years pass, and we end up in World War II. And in order to help our submarines, oceanographic vessels started mapping the ocean floor to provide data for the topographic features of the ocean basin. Harry Hess was a geologist and was long considered one of the founding fathers of plate tectonics. He happened to be a captain of one of these vessels, and while he was stationed in the Pacific Ocean, he found mountains and trenches at the bottom of the ocean. Now we're going to come back to him a little bit later in our story. A young cartographer, that's a person who draws maps, named Marie Tharp, made a brilliant discovery in 1947 after the war, using the data of echo sounding to measure the depth of the Atlantic Ocean. And she found a 12,000-mile long mountain range, but we're going to listen to her story.
In 1912, a German meteorologist named Alfred Wegener proposed a theory about how the Earth's landmasses formed. He suggested that the great continents of the Earth had once formed a single landmass called Pangaea, which had broken up and drifted apart over time. He called this process continental drift, and it went against all conventional thinking of the time, making him very unpopular amongst his peers. It's a shame, because he was absolutely right. But it would take the work of a young cartographer called Marie Tharp to help turn the tide of opposition, leading to one of the greatest paradigm shifts in the earth sciences, and it all began at the bottom of the ocean. Marie's father worked for the Department of Agriculture, and from a young age she'd join him on his work trips as he travelled around the country collecting samples for soil survey maps. These early experiences were formative in developing Marie's interest in geology, and after gaining a master's degree in the subject, she landed a position at Columbia University in 1947. Here she worked as an assistant to Bruce Heason, a geology graduate who's collecting thousands of depth measurements across the Atlantic Ocean. During expeditions, Heason and his team used echo sounding to collect depth data, which involved sending out high-frequency sounds or pings and recording the time delay of the returning echo. The data could then be plotted to build a profile of the terrain below. Unfortunately for Tharp, women were prohibited from joining these early expeditions because of a fear that they'd bring bad luck at sea. Instead, she remained behind at the university to process the data, converting endless rows of depth measurements into detailed profiles of the ocean floor. Conventional thinking had once believed that the ocean floors were flat, featureless plains, but Tharp's maps were beginning to tell an entirely different story. Her profiles reveal the existence of a complex geography of crevices and valleys, but perhaps most startling was the emergence of a long V-shaped cleft that ran through each of her profiles. These so-called rift valleys offered support for Wegener's continental drift theory. If two landmasses were moving apart, they'd split the ocean floor in two, tearing a scar in the landscape and forming a valley below. Was this evidence for the controversial theory? Tharp believed so, but Heason was sceptical, dismissing many of her suggestions as girl talk. Nevertheless, Tharp was convinced by her findings and later produced a more detailed physiographic map to further support her case. At the same time, another graduate student, Howard Foster, was plotting the epicenters of earthquakes in the same region of the Atlantic. Tharp noticed that they occurred at the same location as her proposed valley, and as they expanded to other areas, they found something interesting. Where there were mid-ocean ridges, there were also earthquakes, so it seemed as though these two were related. At this point, even the sceptical Heason could no longer deny what they were looking at. A pattern of scars that spanned the Earth's oceans, permanent wounds torn into existence through the process of continental drift. The findings were finally reported in 1957, but opposition from the scientific community was still fierce. Renowned explorer Jacques Cousteau was so sure they were wrong, he charted an expedition to film the ocean's floor to settle the score once and for all. But the footage he brought back did the opposite. It showed the deep valley, it showed how it split the mid-Atlantic ridge in half, and it showed that Tharp's maps were right all along. It was exactly where she plotted it. As the evidence mounted, a paradigm shift in the earth sciences was inevitable. Tharp's steadfast determination had paved the way for Wegener's continental drift theory to gain traction, and as the tide of opposition waned, it gave birth to our modern understanding of plate tectonics, and secured Tharp's position as one of the most outstanding cartographers of the 20th century.
So here's what the mid-Atlantic ridge looks like. You see a side profile. You found this mountain range right in the middle. Meanwhile, Harry Hess continued his research of the mid-Atlantic ridge, and in 1960 developed the idea that new ocean crust forms along mid-ocean ridges and spreads out laterally away from the ridges. Rock was being forced up from inside the planet. So we're going to look at his story.
World War II. German U-boats were on the prowl. To track them, the Allied forces developed new sonar methods, and scientists were enlisted to help survey the ocean floor. When the United States entered the war, Harry Hess was a geology professor at Princeton University. But he also happened to be a Navy reservist, so it wasn't long before he found himself in command of an attack transport ship in the Pacific. To help maneuver when coming in for a beach landing, Hess's ship was equipped with a depth sounder. Now, still being a geologist at heart, he used the sounder to measure the depth of the ocean floor whenever a ship was out to sea. Now, what he discovered startled him. Until the Second World War, most scientists imagined the bottom of the ocean looked like this. Flat, lined with nothing but sediment. But about 2 miles beneath the waves of the Pacific Ocean, Harry Hess discovered something else entirely. Mountains, like these here in California, with deep canyons and trenches, hundreds of high peaks that we now believe were once active volcanoes, and all of this at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Surprisingly, though, the discovery of the Pacific mountain range is not what makes Harry Hess part of our Great 100. We'll get to that in a minute. To understand where all this is headed, I'd like to skip ahead to another event that set the geology world buzzing. For years, oceanographers surveying the Atlantic Ocean had taken sonar readings that indicated there was something down there, something big. In 1953, they found out what it was, a 12,000-mile-long mountain range. They called it the Mid-Atlantic Ridge.
The reason it's so great.
To fill us in, I paid a visit to Neil Driscoll, a geologist at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography.
One of the big discoveries that was made was that there was this ridge of underwater volcanoes that stood high above the seafloor.
How high is a mountain in the middle of the Atlantic?
The average seafloor depths are on the order of about 4,000 to 5,000 meters. The mid-ocean ridge sits up at about 2,500 meters. So they sit about 2.5 kilometers on average higher than the surrounding seafloor that's shown here in the deep blue color.
So that's over a mile high.
Yes.
Right? And that's where Harry Hess comes back into the story. Analyzing core samples and sonar readings from around the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, Hess made an astonishing discovery, a phenomenon almost beyond comprehension. The age of the Atlantic Ocean floor, he determined, was progressively older the further it moved away from the ridge. Harry Hess had discovered that the seafloor was spreading. He concluded that molten rock was being forced up from inside the Earth at the ridge, where it then formed into new crust on the ocean floor. Gradually, it was pushed away on either side as more molten rock continued pushing up from behind it. Hess called his great discovery seafloor spreading.
So seafloor spreading, when you look at it, you've got the new crust coming up. This is your Rift Valley, and it spreads apart laterally, so you're making new crust. So This is also showing you it happens at divergent plate boundaries, and this is kind of showing you where they all are across the world. And as he said, you have new ocean crust, and you get seafloor spreading. It gets older the farther away from the crust you are. The ages. This is your tectonic plate chart on page 5, where you have the double line is a divergent plate boundary. You can see this divergent plate boundary going through the mid-Atlantic. And notice that Iceland happens to be right on the divergent plate boundary. It's the only place where you can actually see on the surface the divergent plate boundary. This is a picture my daughter took when she was in Iceland, and you can see the divergent plate boundary, and this is the basaltic rock. Here's another picture of the divergent plate boundary. Here's another one. So as the age goes away from it, it gets much higher. This is showing you, again, age increasing away from the mid-Atlantic ridge. This is a diagram showing you how Wegener Pangea broke apart. You have the continental crust being spread apart. You get the Rift Valley, then you eventually get a linear sea, and then you get an Atlantic Ocean. We are going to look at what happens after this, and if we are creating new crust at divergent plate boundaries, is the Earth getting bigger? And that is resoundingly no, but we'll look at that in the next part of our video.